Vergangene Woche bestätigte der Kreml, dass die neue russische Regierung einige personelle Änderungen umfassen werde. Konkret wurde Sergei Shoigu als Verteidigungsminister verabschiedet. Seine Stelle soll nun Andrei Bielousov einnehmen. Während Shoigu auf eine lange militärische Laufbahn zurückblicken kann, ist Bielousov Ökonom und kann kaum Erfahrungen im militärischen Bereich aufweisen. Kreml-Sprecher Dmitri Peskov begründete die Entscheidung damit, dass Bielousov vor allem die Finanzangelegenheiten des Militärs ordnen solle. Was ist deine Einschätzung zu dem neuen russischen Verteidigungsminister? Was wird sich ändern mit Bielousov im Vergleich zu Shoigu? Und welche Auswirkungen hat der Personalwechsel auf die Lage im Ukraine-Krieg?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the word dismissed for Sergei Shoigu. Dismissed implies that he's been fired, he's been relieved for cause, things of this nature. Sergei Shoigu was defense minister at a time when Russia was subjected to very stringent economic sanctions that were designed to destroy the Russian economy. One of the goals behind the destruction of the Russian economy was to prevent Russia from effectively mobilizing its industry for defense purposes, so that the Russian military would be starved of ammunition, of equipment, things of this nature. If you look at the situation today, that's not happened. Why? Because of Sergei Shoigu. Sergei Shoigu went in and got the Russian defense industry up and running, got it to double or triple its output without any detrimental impact on the Russian economy. So Sergei Shoigu has done a fantastic job. He has been the defense minister since 2012. And, prior to that, he was the Minister of Emergency Services from 1991 to 2012. In both jobs, he has done stellar service to his nation. He has been kicked upstairs, I guess you would say. He's now on the National Security Council, and he will advise President Putin on a number of issues, including issues pertaining to the military industry. But here's the thing. The Russian defense industry has grown almost too fast. If you take a look at the history of the Soviet Union, you will see that the growth of Soviet defense industry in the 70s and 80s took over the Soviet economy. It was too large of a presence. With it impacted the domestic economy, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have a situation today where Russian defense industry, although it's producing a lot of tanks, a lot of ammunition, a lot of equipment, is threatening to approach the percentages of the overall Russian economy that the Soviet defense industry had in the Soviet economy. And this could lead to long-term detrimental effect for the Russians. And so what Vladimir Putin has done is brought in Andrei Bielousov, who is a very renowned economist. He is somebody who knows the Russian economy, knows it well enough that he predicted very, very accurately the 2008 economic difficulties and the difficulties that took place in 2012. He's been an advisor to the president for some time now. They call him the Gray Cardinal because he is the wise man who comes in and whispers the news to the president, whether it's good news or bad news. He tells the president the truth about the economy. He's a doctorate in economy. His PhD thesis actually touches upon the very issues we just discussed, how to mobilize the national economy in a more effective manner. His job is to sustain Russian defense industry and even grow it, but make sure that there's a balance in the overall Russian economy. This shows strategic thinking on the part of Vladimir Putin. It shows that Vladimir Putin is thinking beyond this current conflict. He's thinking about Russia's long-term posture in terms of dealing with the collective West. The West claims that it wants to have this strategic adversarial relationship with Russia that includes expanding NATO. What Vladimir Putin just did is say, okay, but we've got you beat. We've got a defense industry that already outstrips what you do. And we're going to ensure that this defense industry is in a position to continue to outproduce the West without doing damage to the overall Russian economy, which is a growing economy, an expansive economy. So this is what Mr. Belousov's role will be. Now, it's important to note that Gennady Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the Russian armed forces, did not yet relieved. He is in command of the Russian military. And I think Mr. Peskov made it clear that there will be a distinction between the duties of Mr. Belousov as Minister of Defense, which are primarily focused on balancing defense industry with the Russian economy, and the duties of Gennady Gerasimov, who will continue to manage the military aspects of the Russian military, the war, and how to manage the actual military units, etc. There will be no disruption in Russia's defense industry or in Russia's defense. And for all those people who point to this and say, well, this proves that Putin's in a panic and that Russia is collapsing, it proves the exact opposite. Putin is in total control, and Russia is adapting in a very precise manner to the reality of the situation it confronts on the global stage today.
Welche Rolle spielen bei der Neuordnung des russischen Verteidigungsministeriums die Anklagen über Korruption und Bestechlichkeit gegen einige ranghohe Offiziere und Mitarbeiter des Verteidigungsministeriums? Wie stark könnte diese Korruption dem russischen Militär geschadet haben in der Vergangenheit?
Look, there was a high-profile arrest of a deputy minister of defense on charges of corruption. So we can't pretend that corruption doesn't exist. We also know that when Russia underwent its the partial mobilization of 300,000 men, that many of the issues that plagued that process dealt with the impact of corruption, that some of the military commissars who were supposed to have been stockpiling the necessary items needed to mobilize troops in an expeditious and efficient fashion hadn't done their jobs, had diverted the money elsewhere, probably their pockets. And, in some cases, this equipment wasn't there. The corruption is a problem that Russia has been battling since the end of the Soviet Union. During the 1990s, Russia was overwhelmed by corruption. The oligarchs who took control of the Russian economy through corrupt practices, stealing from pensioners, taking the coupons that had been issued as part of the distribution of state property and buying them back at low rates. Allowed them to accumulate great wealth. And when Vladimir Putin took over as president at the end of 1999, he was dealing with one of the most corrupt nations on the planet. He has been struggling ever since then to reverse that tide. But when you have a patient that you're trying to revive, you can't try to cure everything at once or you kill the patient. The patient still needs to live. And so Vladimir Putin had to hold his nose at certain economic realities. And some of those realities were not just the corruption of the oligarchs, but the fact that every aspect of Russian economic and civil life was seeped in corruption. And this meant that practices in terms of defense procurement were corrupt. People were making money off of this. Now, he and his government have been fighting this and doing a good job in reversing it, but it clearly hasn't been completely eliminated, and it's an ongoing problem. And it's a problem when a deputy minister of defense is arrested for corruption. So we don't want to pretend, and any observer of Russia would be wrong if they tried to say that Russia doesn't have a corruption problem. Russia does have a corruption problem. Um, but Mr. Belousov is going to face this problem as well as Mr. Shoigu did. It's an ongoing problem, but it's at a far lesser degree than it was when Vladimir Putin took over a quarter century ago. And I would say that today it gets a lot of attention. The West puts a microscope on it, and everybody looks at it. But I think if I dig through German newspapers, I'll find evidence of corruption in the defense industry. I'll find evidence of bribes being given to German parliamentarians. I'll find evidence of fraudulent tax returns. I'll find evidence of overprice, and I know I'll find that in the United States, where corruption. We have a Pentagon that can't pass an audit, with trillions of dollars missing, trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars missing. So, I don't want to I don't want to pretend that corruption isn't a problem in Russia, but I think it's important that when we talk about, because I look at the intent of your question, and it's to say, is this a problem for Russia? Yes, it is a problem for Russia, but I think the problem that Russia faces today is of a similar nature, or even less of on a lesser scope and scale than the problems of corruption that exist in the West. And unlike the West, Russia appears to have a targeted policy of eliminating corruption. And I think that that's the direction Russia will continue to operate in. Clearly, this corruption, while being a problem, hasn't manifested in the inability of Russia to carry out effective military operations. Their military is doing quite well on the battlefield. Their defense industry is doing quite well. But corruption is a problem, and it's one that the future Minister of Defense is going to have to deal with.
Wenn wir über Korruption im russischen Militär sprechen, hatte die Korruption irgendwelche Auswirkungen auf die russischen Streitkräfte im Ukraine-Krieg? Wir erinnern uns, dass Wagner-Chef Jewgeni Prigoschin einst genau diesen Kritikpunkt vertreten hatte.
The interesting thing about the Wagner experience is that the corruption that was manifest was less about the corruption of the Russian military, more about the corruption of Prigozhin as an individual. His, the Wagner, private military contractor scheme was always premised on being a money-making venture for him. It allowed him to enrich himself, and it allowed people around him to become quite wealthy. They received very favorable contracts from the Ministry of Defense, and his institution. I think he had a catering business as well that also received a very large contract from the Ministry of Defense to provide food for Russian forces. His Wagner enterprise extended into Africa, where he engaged in a number of bilateral economic activities with African states, African businesses that enriched the Wagner enterprise. Wagner could get away with this as long as the Donbass region in which they fought was independent of Russia, because Russian law prohibits private military contractors from operating on Russian soil. But after the referendum of September 2022, when the Donbass was absorbed into Russia, the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Defense required that Wagner reorganize in a manner which was consistent with Russian law, that the Wagner forces would have to become contracted to the Ministry of Defense and be subjected to their direction, their training, their logistics. This is something that Prigozhin resisted because it meant a loss of money for him. So the corruption that is manifest in the Wagner experience is more about the corruption of Yevgeny Prigozhin, not about the corruption of the Ministry of Defense. And of course, today we see that that issue has been resolved. Prigozhin is dead, and his Wagner forces have been largely absorbed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. I think most notably Ratibor, the commander of the 1st Wagner Assault Group, one of the elite formations of Wagner that captured Soledar and Bakhmut. He has signed a contract along with 3,000 of his best fighters with the Russian Ministry of Defense, and he's now working as part of the or an extension of the Akhmat Special Forces with Abdi Aldanov. We have other examples of the Russian of Wagner being incorporated to what is known as the Africa Corps of the Russian Ministry of Defense to continue the Wagner activities in Africa. And indeed, some Africa Corps members are fighting on the Kharkov front today in Ukraine. So I don't see a continuation of corruption from the Wagner thing. I see that Russia has resolved the Wagner issue. So no, I don't think that the Wagner experience points to inherent corruption on the part of the Russian military.
Auch auf Seiten der Ukraine gab es eine Reihe von Personalwechseln. So hat der ukrainische Präsident Wladimir Zelensky seinen nationalen Sicherheitschef Sergei Rud abgesetzt und auch einige militärische Befehlshaber in der Region Kharkov sollen ausgetauscht worden sein. Gleichzeitig warnt Kiew die ukrainische Bevölkerung vor, dass ab dem kommenden Wochenende das neue Mobilisierungsgesetz in Kraft treten werde. Damit solle laut einer Pressemeldung des ukrainischen Verteidigungsministeriums die gesamte Gesellschaft mobilisiert werden. Welche Wirkung können der Austausch von Kommandeuren und die Massenmobilisierung auf den Ukraine-Krieg haben? Kann die Ukraine durch eine Art Volkssturm noch einen Umschwung im Kriegsgeschehen erwirken?
According to Mr. Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Ukraine has run out of troops. The Russian offensive in the Kharkov area has required Ukraine to take its last reserves and send them to that front. There are no reserves left. Meanwhile, the Russians continue to operate along the entire line of contact. Ukraine has run out of troops. This problem will only get worse as Russia continues to slaughter Ukrainian troops on the front lines. Russia hasn't run out of troops. They continue to introduce new military formations into the battlefield. This mobilization law, that takes place next week will not solve any problems. Ukraine needs troops now, and it's not just bodies. They need trained troops, troops that are organized, troops that are equipped, troops that have logistical sustainability. None of these exist. None of them will exist. This is the end of Ukraine. This is the collapse that people have been predicting. And this collapse will be furthered if Russia continues to introduce new troops on new fronts. There's rumors that Russia will open up or expand its northern, advance that is currently ongoing in Kharkov to the Sumy area. And if they start moving on Sumy, where are the forces they're going to defend Sumy? They don't exist. Are they going to strip Kharkov to go to Sumy? Then that makes the Russians advance further on Kharkov. They're pulling troops out of Kherson. They're going to be pulling troops out of Zaporizhia. As they withdraw these troops from the front, they withdrew the 3rd Assault Brigade, the elite Azov Nazi formation from the Chasiv Yar direction. Who's defending Chasiv Yar now if they're gone? The point is the Russians will continue to advance, and this advance will become precipitous if Ukraine doesn't seek to carry out a precipitous retreat of its own to more defensible lines. We're looking at a total collapse of the Ukrainian front lines, and there's nothing that can happen in terms of mobilization that can reverse this. This is a situation that has no cure. And this is the reality of it. I mean, one of the reasons why the Russians are advancing in Kharkov isn't just manpower, it's corruption. The Ukrainians had received a tremendous amount of money from the European Union, from Great Britain, from the United States, specifically to create fortifications that protected Kharkov, that will protect Kiev, that will protect Sumy. And it appears that this money, instead of being used to build these fortifications, went into the pockets of corrupt Ukrainian officials. And now we have a situation where Russia is advancing and there are no defenses. The Ukrainians have nothing to stop the Russians. And so, this is the reality. Ukraine has always been known to be one of the more corrupt nations on the planet, and the impact of this corruption is playing out before us in real time in Kharkov, in Sumy, and elsewhere.
Seit Monaten sprechen die westlichen Medien von der Lieferung von F-16-Kampfjets an die Ukraine, die wie ein Wunder das Kriegsgeschehen zugunsten Kiews wenden sollen. Jetzt soll es endlich soweit sein. Laut Medienberichten sollen Dänemark und die Niederlande noch diesen Sommer die ersten F-16 Kampfjets in die Ukraine liefern. Damit ist jedoch nicht das Problem der überlegenen russischen Luftabwehr behoben. Laut dem Magazin Business Insider ging die ukrainische Luftwaffe dazu über, eine US-Taktik aus dem Vietnamkrieg einzusetzen, den sogenannten Wild Weasel. Kannst du unseren Zuschauern erklären, was das für eine Taktik ist und wie damit die gegnerische Luftwaffe ausgehebelt werden soll? Verspricht eine Kombination von F-16 Kampfjets und wildem Wiesel eine Erfolgschance gegen die russische Luftabwehr?
Wild Weasels are it's a name given to aircraft which are specifically, the crew are trained and they have special weapons that allow them to suppress enemy air defenses. Wild Weasel crews, it's a term that dates back to the Vietnam War, primarily F-4s, but also F-105s flew in that role. And their job was to go in and trigger, provoke enemy air defense systems to turn on their radars, and then to attack these radars, to get the enemy to fire their surface-to-air missiles and then attack the surface-to-air missiles either with precision bombing or with standoff anti-radiation missiles. The F-16 took on the Wild Weasel role during the Gulf War in 1991. There were still F-4 Wild Weasels, but the F-16 took on that role. And today, the F-16 is the primary Wild Weasel platform. You need to understand that the Wild Weasel doesn't exist in and of itself. It's part of an overall systemic approach to aerial warfare that requires, electronic warfare capability. The Wild Weasel, for instance, in the air war over Kosovo, the Wild Weasel team paired with EA-6 intruder aircraft or Prowler aircraft. The EA-6s would provide standoff target acquisition, standoff jamming, and do target location. Then the F-16s would, based upon this information, go in and do their work. Do the Ukrainians have the EA-6 Prowler? And the answer is no. Of course they don't. So right off the bat, they have a problem. Two, you need extraordinarily experienced pilots. This is a very dangerous tactic, one that requires skill that is practiced for years. The U.S. Air Force Wild Weasel pilots often fly in what's known as red flag exercises in Nellis Air Base in Nevada, where they carry out very realistic training. Have any of these Ukrainian pilots undergone the red flag training? No, they haven't. And so I think this is fantasy. This is like saying that if I dressed up as if I just walked onto the field in Real Madrid and put on a jersey with the number 10 with the name Messi on my back, that suddenly I'll be scoring goals, or Barcelona, or Miami, where he's at now. No, just because you dress like it, just because you put a name on your back, doesn't mean that you can perform like it. And the Ukrainians simply can't do the Wild Weasel task. This is an absurdity in the extreme. First of all, premises that the Ukrainian aircraft will be able to operate from Ukrainian airfields. They will not. It also implies that the Russians will yield enough Ukrainian airspace to the Ukrainians to give them an operational depth so that Wild Weasels can take off, can get oriented, can get organized before approaching the battlefield. I think the moment that the F-16s arrive on Ukrainian soil, they'll be bombed, they'll be targeted, there'll be no rest for them at all. This Wild Weasel fantasy is just that. It's a fantasy. It won't happen. The Ukrainians lack the skill set. They lack the weapons. They lack everything about it. It's a coping mechanism by the West to try and justify and trying to breathe hope into those who continue to support Ukraine. You have to have people believe that their investments will pay off. And right now, people understand that Russia dominates with air defense. Russia dominates with air power. And unless you can change that equation, it doesn't make any sense to continue providing money and weapons to Ukraine. So the Wild Weasel is a fantasy designed to assuage the psyche of the people who continue to support Ukraine.
Die Frage der Lufthoheit in der Ukraine beherrscht auch die deutsche Politik. Am vergangenen Wochenende veröffentlichte die FAZ Aussagen einiger Politiker, die sich für einen Einsatz der Bundeswehr zur Überwachung des ukrainischen Luftraums aussprechen. Darunter der Grünen-Politiker Anton Hofreiter, Markus Faber von der FDP und Roderich Kiesewetter von der CDU. Konkret geht es dabei um eine von der NATO etablierte Flugverbotszone und die Möglichkeit für die Bundeswehr, russische Raketen abzuschießen. Die Bundesregierung hat nun zurückgerudert und nimmt Abstand von den Aussagen, die allerdings auch von Vertretern der Regierungsparteien stammen. Was hältst du von der Idee einer NATO-Flugverbotszone in der Ukraine? Wäre das überhaupt ein realisierbares Szenario für die Bundeswehr? Wäre sie militärisch in der Lage, eine solche Flugverbotszone durchzusetzen?
Well, it's not so much important what I think. Sergei Lavrov has responded, and he said, to paraphrase him, if NATO wants to commit suicide, commit suicide. We can't stop you. If you want to come to Ukraine, then we will kill you in Ukraine. But the Russians have taken it a step further because the implication of what the Germans have spoken about is projecting NATO, military capabilities from NATO into Ukraine, meaning that some of these German capabilities might be based in Poland and extending their sphere of influence into Ukrainian airspace. Russia has made it clear that if that happens, then the German facilities on Polish soil will be struck. And indeed, Russia can continue this all the way up to striking the decision-making centers in Germany itself. This is why the German government has distanced itself, because they know, this is a death sentence for Germany. The German military lacks the capacity to do this. With all due respect to these German politicians, they've been reading too many German military magazines where you have officers who are sitting at a desk, again, fat people drinking beer and schnitzel in their off-duty hours, who really know nothing about war, who write academic papers about the theory of power projection. Well, when theory meets reality, reality always wins. And the reality is that the Russian military today enjoys a level of competence and superiority over anything Germany has, anything NATO has. So this is a fantasy. NATO would never be able to create and enforce and sustain a no-fly zone over Ukraine. It would be the end of NATO, because NATO itself would become a target, and NATO today can't fight. The German Air Force has zero capacity. I mean, have they solved their maintenance problems overnight? It's just a curious question to the German Air Force. How many of your airplanes can actually get off the ground? Because the last time I checked, not too many. Last time I checked, you have a maintenance problem. Last time I checked, you have a supply problem. You have a spare parts problem. You have a competence problem. What are the air hours that your pilots have been flying? These pilots you want to enforce the no-fly zone, do they even know how to fly their airplanes anymore? And the answer is no, they don't. Do they know how to do anything anymore? They're a barracks army. Had they actually been in the field practicing the techniques that would be needed to expand air defense into Russia? Do they know what it's like to be on the receiving end of Russian firepower? And the answer is no, they don't. This is just what this is a domestic political issue. These are people who are posturing to oppose the ruling party, to make it appear that they have a solution, that if they were in power, they could have solved this problem. Well, they can't. They're not in power. They can't solve the problem. And it's just really suicidal to even consider any of the things that they were putting on the table.